John chapter 8, verse 12 to 20. Jesus spoke to the people once more and said, "I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life." The Pharisees replied, "You're making those claims about yourself. Such testimony is not valid." Jesus told them, "These claims are valid, even though I make them about myself. For I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you don't know this about me. You judge me by human standards, but I do not judge anyone. And if I did, my judgment would be correct in every respect, because I am not alone. The Father who sent me is with me. Your own law says that if two people agree about something, their witness is accepted as fact. I am one witness, and my Father who sent me is the other." "Where is your Father?" they asked. Jesus answered, "Since you don't know who I am, you don't know who my Father is. If you knew me, you would also know my Father." Jesus made these statements while he was teaching in the section of the temple known as the treasury, but he was not arrested because his time had not yet come. So what's going on here? Jesus makes what some people might consider to be somewhat cryptic statements about his Father, about who he is in regard to his Father. He talks about the law and talks about being his own witness and all sorts of stuff. What's really going on here? What was the context of this conversation? What happened last time? So Jesus was teaching. And last time, you find that Jesus was teaching, and in the middle of his teaching, the Pharisees break into the crowd that he's teaching in and throw a woman in front of him. And then they challenge him, and then he challenges them on the basis of their own law. Okay? This is really a continuation of this part. John chapter 8 is really interesting in regard to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees do not give him simple challenges. They're very complex challenges. We might think of them as simple, but they're not actually simple. On top of it, how many times do they stop him? 10 times. In John chapter 8, you see the Pharisees. My mic is really hot, by the way. In John chapter 8, you see the Pharisees interrupt and challenge Jesus 10 times in the middle of his conversation. And there's a couple reasons for that. John chapter 8 is really interesting because whereas in other places you see people not really understanding who Jesus is or what he's claiming, here we see the opposite. Here we see that the Pharisees really sort of understand what Jesus is claiming. They don't like what they're hearing, and that's why they're having a problem. So the Pharisees challenge Jesus 10 times during this. And we see Jesus step outside of that challenge and sort of spin it back to them and give it back to them and ask them to stand up to their own standards. But now Jesus is about to get really heavy with them. So, what you should probably understand about the setting of this. I gave you the political setting. Let me give you the physical setting of what's going on. The Jews have a feast. It's called the Feast of the Tabernacles. It takes place over several days. I think it's a week, but it's over several days period, okay? And during this feast, the Feast of the Tabernacles, we find that the Jews are celebrating the way that God led them out of Egypt. So what was the way that God led them out of Egypt? Huh? A pillar of fire. So God led them out through a pillar of fire. He did this at night. Okay? So let me say that in a different, more obvious way. God, in the darkness, led the Jews out as a pillar of fire. Now, the way that the Jews would celebrate this during the Feast of the Tabernacles is in the beginning of the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Jews would light these really ornate candelabras, lamps, essentially. And they would keep them going all night long. And they had priests that would constantly be going with lighters, not the way we think of, torches, okay? And they would light up the night. Now, think about this from the standpoint of a not even medieval culture, but not even a third world culture. You know, in third world countries, we have electricity. There's like brownouts and things like that, right? Do they have electricity back then? Or could they harness electricity back then? No. They were not able to harness electricity. So at night, where did light come from? Candle, fire. And if you were to look at a city at night, would it look anything like what it looks like now? No, it wouldn't. It was dark. There would be a few lights, but essentially when the sun went down, the city went down too, okay? Except during the Feast of the Tabernacles. During the Feast of the Tabernacles, those candelabras were lit up, and the Jewish temple was lit up. I mean, it was lit up. It was like high, okay? So, play on lit up. So, the temple was lit up like a Christmas tree. And it was shining bright in the middle of the night for everybody to see. I did not mean that to rhyme. This was done for most of the week. But by the end of the week, when Jesus starts to preach, they stop lighting for the ceremony. So what major thing was present in the minds of the Pharisees and the Jews? The light. So, do you think it's by accident that Jesus says, I am the light of the world? It's not. Because it was very, very, very clear and obvious to the Jews during that time, on that day, in that place, that Jesus was ascribing himself to God. Because the Jews had just been in a time of light during the dark. Now, they're not lighting those candelabras anymore. Now, they're in a time of darkness. And so during this time of darkness, right as they come out of the light into the darkness, Jesus takes that moment to ascribe himself to being the light. And it's very, very important. It's very important because they were taught to view God in terms of light. Looking back at Psalms 27, verse 1. Someone want to read that? Anyone? Psalms 27, verse 1. The Israelites were trained to sing that song, a Psalm of David. They were 27:1. The Israelites were trained to sing that song. In fact, there's a song that we have, we don't ever sing it, but it is a worship song that says the exact same thing. He's my light, he's my fortress, he's my deliverer, in him will I trust. Praise the name of Jesus. So, the Israelites were trained to think of God as light. The Messiah was going to come as the light of the world. When Jesus steps before them at the end of the Feast of the Tabernacles and he says, I am the light of the world, he is proclaiming himself to be the Messiah. And he's proclaiming himself to be the Messiah at a time when it was very, very obvious, when light as God was at the forefront of the minds and imaginations and the hearts of the Jews and the leaders. But does Jesus do this in quiet, off in the ghetto? No. Where does he do it? He does it in the temple area. He does it in the temple. Specifically, where he talks about light in the temple area is in a place called the Court of Women. Now, the Court of Women, which is, awesome, because Jesus always gives credit to women, but the Court of Women is a place where they've got these, 13 offering plates, essentially. Way more ornate than that. So it's essentially the treasury of the temple. What you need to understand is that there's a group of people called the Sanhedrin. Do you know what the Sanhedrin is? The Sanhedrin is the leadership of the temple. It's made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. The room where the Sanhedrin meets is literally off to the side of the Court of Women. So as Jesus is preaching, he is not preaching in the ghetto of Jerusalem. He's not proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, off in the distance where people can't hear him. He is standing literally outside of the area where the Pharisees meet, where they have their secret meetings. He stands outside their area and he talks to the people in front of where people place their money for the temple, and he states, "I am the Messiah. I am the light of the world." That's pretty ballsy, right? That's a big deal. Jesus has decided that he wants to pick a fight, essentially. But is he picking a fight the way that we like to pick fights? No. This isn't the fight of a man who is being irrational. This is the fight of a man who's being incredibly tactical. And the Pharisees make a judgment call on him that we talked about last week, where they think that he's being irrational. They think last time, right? Does that stop the Pharisees? The Pharisees prove this type of attack is called an a priori attack. Do you know what that means? It means that they don't attack him on the basis of what he claims. Instead, they attack him on something else. It's called an a priori attack. It's an irrational attack. Now, you would think that they would know better, because they tried to attack the woman that way earlier, and they tried to bring Jesus into it that way earlier. But he took it, and he spun it, and he gave it back to them, and they couldn't deal with it. So what do they do when he says, "I am the light of the world"? What is it that they say to him? Right. They don't say, "No, you're not." They say, "You can't claim that." Now, mind you, this is the temple. This is the place where these people are judges, are leaders, and they don't dispute the claim of Christ, but instead try to entrap him in the law. They try to use his own argument against him. What argument am I talking about? No. What had just happened? What had just happened last week? When the woman was brought before Jesus, we talked about the fact that there needed to be 2 witnesses, right? So instead of saying to Jesus, no, you're not the light of the world, what did they say to him? They say, well, if you really are the light of the world, you need 2 witnesses, right? Because now they think they're being clever. So how does Jesus deal with that? Does he break form? And does he say, nuh-uh? Yes, he gives it back to them. He says to them, actually, I do need 2 witnesses. But in order for somebody to be a witness according to your law, they have to have observed something. They have to have observed God. They have to have observed these things. Except, Pharisees, you've never observed God. You never knew Moses. You didn't know Abraham. So how can you be a witness? But I am God. I am the Messiah. And so I've observed Abraham, and I've observed God, so that makes me a witness. So instead of Jesus being thrown for a loop, Jesus gives it right back to them. And he continues the path of them setting the tone, and then he takes their tone, and he says, yeah, let's see this through. You think this is a good idea, let's see it through. And so they give it back to him. And then what do? They ask him where his father is. This is a really important thing. Why? Jesus says, I am a witness and my Father is a witness. Is Jesus being clever when he says his Father is a witness? Who's he speaking of? He's talking about God. Who do you think the Pharisees were speaking of? Joseph. So what do you think they were doing? They were hitting him with a low blow, right? Because it is a well-known fact that Jesus, in Jewish culture, had Joseph not chosen to marry Mary, would have been an illegitimate child without a father. So now the Pharisees have gone even further, because it's not just an a priori attack. Now they've decided to attack his paternity. They've decided to attack his personhood. They've said, you're going to speak about having fathers? Where's your father, you illegitimate bastard? That's what this is saying. That is what the Pharisees were doing to Christ. It's interesting that in all of this, the Pharisees did not say anything about his claim, right? Pharisees, leaders of the temple. Can someone read John chapter 7, verses 25 to 27? Chapter 7, 25 through 27. So the events that John was reading took place one day before these events, because Jesus was doing what he does. And during that time, the people, and mind you, they would be saying the exact same thing because it wasn't done, the people were asking themselves, aren't these people the leaders of the temple? Why don't they just get rid of them? What was one thing that really impressed the people about Jesus in regard to the Pharisees? It's not just that he stood up to them. Go deeper. What was different? What was different about Jesus versus the way that the Pharisees taught? When the Pharisees taught, when the Pharisees acted, they acted a certain way. But Jesus specifically acted in this way. Nope. Commanding. The term is with authority. Jesus was known by the people to speak with authority. The Pharisees don't speak with authority. They speak with an air of, I'm better than you. But Jesus, when he spoke like he believed it. Now he's speaking with authority in the temple, the place where the Pharisees have authority. And yet, the Pharisees seem to have no authority to stop him, to throw him out. And he's not doing that off in the far places of the temple. He's doing it right next to their meeting space. Again, it's very ballsy. And so, they're getting flustered. And they're making low jabs at him. They're calling him a bastard. And how does Jesus react to that? He says, since you don't know who I am, you don't know who my Father is. If you knew me, you would also know my Father. Instead, he turns it back to them, and he says, yeah, that's right. You don't know who my Father is. You say, where's my Father? Yeah, you're right. You don't know who my Father is. Because you're incompetent, because you're ignorant, because you don't know who I am. And here's where we see Jesus start to steer the ship. He starts to put it into the direction. Up to this point, Jesus has sort of let them do their thing. He's taken it and he's run with it. But now they start to attack him on the basis of who he is. And at this point, Jesus says, okay, now we're going to get rough. And eventually this confrontation, which we'll read on next week and further, leads to his most profound statement. Before Abraham was, I am. And at that point, they are so desperate that there's nothing they can do. They can't hit him with low blows, sticks and stones. They can't do that to him. So then what do? They decide they have to kill him. Because, that's the next natural step, of course. Can't do it. You can't pick on your enemies. You can't bully them. Kill them. So, yeah. So Jesus made these statements, and he begins to set the tone. But before he sets the tone, he lets them follow their arguments through. How does all of this apply to us? Well, honestly, it applies to us on the basis of being Pharisees. We like to associate with Jesus. But the reality of it is that most of us associate more with Pharisees. Again, who were the Pharisees? They were the leaders, yeah. They were leaders of the church of its time, and they didn't call themselves the church. They were the nation of Jews, But essentially, they were the religious authorities of the time. Last week, I talked about the difference between right and righteous. The Pharisees were right. They were all about being right. And yet, we have them here in their struggle to be right, to maintain control. We have them doing what? Grasping, right? They're putting into evidence things that they don't have a right to put into evidence. They're putting into evidence facts that don't actually exist, like the fact that Jesus was from Galilee and not born in Bethlehem. They could have figured all of this out ahead of time. But instead of assessing the threat that was there and taking that and looking at it and honestly asking about it. Instead, they were trying to remain in the right. And so they settled for facts that didn't exist. And the truth just walked by them without them seeing it. If it had been a snake, they'd be dead. And they went even further than that. Then when they couldn't grasp successfully, then what did they do? They started to attack. And the level on which they started to attack was low. I mean, that's really pathetic. It's a terrible thing. Now think about the way that we act as human beings. When we are struggling to be in the right, isn't that the process that we take? When we're struggling to be in the right, we want to deny loss. So we immediately jump to anger. And this is obviously deny. So you're in the denial stage. In the denial stage, you're doing what? You're grasping. You're saying, no, this can't be true. You know, there's no way that I lost my keys. But then it becomes, I'm so angry that I lost my keys. You know? And then from there, it leads over time to, maybe it's not so bad. And then it becomes, my life is over. I'm going to have to go get, and there's I can't. But then eventually you settle down and you're like, all right, I'll just go get new keys. Except we're not talking about keys. We're talking about relationships. And in relationships, when that happens, when people want to deny the truth of things, and they start to go through the processes of loss, and then they add anger to the equation, and then they add bartering to the equation, and then they add despair to the equation, what we end up with in relationships are things like divorce. I'm so angry at my husband. At first, I didn't think there was an issue. Now I know there's an issue, and I'm angry at my husband. But you know what? As long as I maintain a relationship with my kids, that'll be fine. Now my kid is grown up and they hate me. My life is terrible. The Pharisees were doing just that. And when I talk about divorce, it seems like it doesn't apply, but it actually does. Because what relationship are we talking about here? God. Very good. And the Pharisees had a prime relationship with God. And the Pharisees didn't want to admit that they had a problem. And so when God himself walks up to them and says, "What are you doing?" their response is to kill him. Their response is to hit him with low blows. Their response is to become murderous in their hearts before they will have a right relationship with God. Because as long as I'm dotting my I's and crossing my T's, I'm a good wife. As long as I'm saying, "I love you, God," I'm a good wife. As long as I'm reading my Bible, I'm a good wife. But that's not really true. Because it is about the spirit of truth. And when Christ came, what did he say to the Samaritan woman? Remember the woman at the well that he wasn't supposed to be associating with, but he did? What did he say to her? This is just a couple chapters before. He said, yes, he revealed the truth of things. He said, there is coming a time where people will worship in spirit and in truth. No longer a need for the temple. Is this to say that the temple then is irrelevant? No. Just like, is it to say that the marriage relationship is irrelevant? No. So, I mean, if you have a couple who's infatuated with each other, isn't that enough? Or is there something valid to proclaiming and owning and holding to statutes together and loving each other on the basis of those statutes?
Some people would say that that's not valid. That's how people treat their relationship with the church too, right? People's idea of relationship with God is just like that. In regard to the church, I don't have to go to church. I have a relationship with God. I worship in spirit and in truth. But that would be like saying to your wife, I don't have to hang out with you. I love you. That's ridiculous. You need both. If God values the church, you should value the church. If God values salvation, you should value salvation. If God values morals, you should value morals. It's not enough to say, I love God, therefore everything's good. Why should I commit to anything? God committed to me, that's enough. As long as he commits to me, it's enough. But it's not that way. And the Pharisees had gotten so wrapped up in their own reality that that's what they were doing. They were standing before Christ, who for all intents and purposes was the husband that they had been longing for, that they had been preparing the Jewish nation for centuries. They were standing before their husband and saying to him, I don't need you. I don't want you. I don't like you. Who do you think you are to come into my life this way? Now, were they saying to him, you're not my husband? Were they challenging his claim to be the Messiah? No. What they were doing was saying that the light that you bring is not a light that I want. There's no doubt in anybody's mind at this time that Christ brought enlightenment. But what they were saying is, I don't want it. Somebody read John chapter 1, verse 1 through whenever. I'll tell you when to stop. You can stop. That's a beautiful treatise. I love it. It's a treatise that's incredibly philosophical. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. ... And the world was the light of all men. ... And they did not recognize him. Do you see the allusion here to John chapter 1? Christ specifically says, he starts off this section by saying, I am the light of all men. And what happened? The Pharisees, they didn't want that light. They got no problem saying that it's light coming from him. But they don't want that light because they did not recognize him. That is the profound story that repeats over and over and over and over in Scripture and in our lives. God establishes himself a certain way. He takes it from us. We bend him over and he takes it from us. Just so that we will possibly have the chance of understanding who he is. But we don't. Instead, we discard him when we're done. You think that that's graphic. You think that that's possibly ridiculous. It's not graphic. God states very, very clearly that the relationships that we have with other things are adulterous and that he is a jealous God. He's so profoundly abhorrent about the way that we treat him that he once sent a prophet to go get married to a whore and then have her whore around on that prophet so that that prophet could speak very clearly about how it feels to have a wife that does that to him. So when the darkness tries to take him over, and when the people do not comprehend that he is the light of the world, and that he is the Messiah, and he is their love, it's a big deal. It is a deep, profound, gaping wound for God. And then to take it as the man Jesus and go one step further and say, you're a bastard. Not the way that we say, you're a bastard, you killed Kenny. But to literally say, you have no father on top of it. Can you imagine saying that to your significant other? To hurt their feelings? This is the level at which the religious leaders had gotten to. They couldn't recognize him for who he was. And their absolute purpose was to hurt his feelings. And then when that didn't work, they tried to kill him. Where do we stand in our relationship with God? I take it to that level because it is at that level. To be right, do we just try to meet the standards versus setting them? And what were the Pharisees trying to do? They were just trying to follow the laws. But then you have people like David, who constantly was breaking the laws, but he set standards of truth in worship. To be right, do we hide our downfalls versus own our shortcomings? Do we accept the fact that we're flawed and give that to our significant other? And obviously, when I'm saying significant other, I mean God, but that can apply. Do we accept that we're flawed and stand naked before God, or do we hide that? To be right, do we speak instead of listen? Do we take somebody who's speaking out of spirit and truth and talk over them, or do we listen to what they're saying? If they had just listened to what was being said, isn't it the most interesting conundrum that everybody over the course of history of varying religions will say that Christ is a good teacher, is the most amazing teacher, is a profound human being in the existence of mankind? Those people don't believe what Christ was saying, but they cannot deny that there was something valuable being said. These people who believed the very things that Christ was talking about, they were so closed off that they couldn't even listen. They had to speak over him. Instead of listening to the arguments that he gave them, they tried to turn them on him. Because, like so many people that we've met, they weren't really listening. What they were looking for was the next spot for them to interject something. Everybody's met people like that, right? Where you know that that person in your argument or even discussion, they're not listening to you. They're waiting to talk. That's what the Pharisees were doing. Is that what we do to God? When God is putting something out there to us, are we just waiting to talk? Or are we actually listening to it, to the profundity of it? To be right, we often assume instead of investigate. Like I stated earlier, they could have investigated. This guy is making waves in their community. The logical, wise thing to do would be to investigate him. But they were afraid to. Now you got some people, Nicodemus for instance, he went and he talked to Christ. And that's where we get the very powerful statement, John 3:16. Christ talking to Nicodemus in secret about how you have to be born again. Nicodemus goes to investigate Christ. And when the rest of the Pharisees are attacking him later, Nicodemus states, you guys just need to listen to the man. He says, your own laws state that people should have a right to speak for themselves. Of course, they don't listen to Nicodemus either. But a wise person investigates instead of assumes the fact. Why do they deny the facts? Why did they deny even the opportunity to investigate? Because they wanted to be right. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to be right. And remember, the two are not synonymous to each other. To be right, we often attack instead of embrace. When it came down to it, it should have been enough to embrace Christ in what he was saying. To say, okay, I can see your point. Maybe I don't believe what you're saying. Maybe I disagree with you. But then they go and attack him. That is somebody who wants to be right, doesn't want to be righteous. To be right, we often stand still in the dark rather than stumble in the light. What is the adage by John Milton? Come on, I love doing this to you guys. John Milton, let's think about this. John Milton was a character played by Al Pacino in The Devil's Advocate. No, that's not the one. John Milton wrote Paradise Lost with Bradley. And what was it that John Milton said through the auspices of Lucifer in Paradise Lost? It is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. How often have we come to God with the concept that it's better for us to have a little slice of our own heaven, a large slice of our own heaven than have a little slice of his? Better to take it now than possibly never get it later. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The righteous man is willing to stumble in the light, is willing to be blinded to figure it out. A person who just wants to be right, they stand still. How many of you know a person, or perhaps are a person, in your life who rather than be wrong, will just stand still? Be honest with yourselves. How many of you are so afraid to make a move that you won't even make a move so that you can't be wrong? We all know people like that, right? Out of paranoia and fear, they try to do what they think is right, to stay in the right, and life goes by, and all of a sudden 10 years have gone by, and what you thought was protecting your life actually was wasting it. That is the person who wants to be right. But a righteous man like David is willing to rip off his clothes and run naked before God, even if it may not be right. And believe it or not, God rewards that. The righteous know God, and they listen for his voice. The righteous find their enlightenment in worship. They find it by spirit, by truth, and relationship. How is it that the right find enlightenment. Let me put it in other terms. A person that you know that thinks they're right all the time generally thinks they're right because of what? What do they use to back up being right? Fact. Rules. Truths. Okay? People who are right back up themselves by facts. But you know what? Sometimes that's not enough. I think of the case of William Calley. Who knows what I'm talking about? World War II. Actually, it was Vietnam. William Calley in Vietnam. Or how about the Nuremberg trials? These men served their country. They were following orders. They did what was right. Except, regardless of the fact that they can back up that they did what was right, they were wrong. They were wrong in here. Because being righteous is about spirit. Being righteous is about truth. Being righteous is about relationship. What did Christ say was the summation of being righteous? When they tried to tell him, what is the most important thing you can do to be righteous? They were trying to trap him. What did he say? Love God with your heart, soul, spirit, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It wasn't, let me think about what rules make you right, and then I'll find the best one for you. It was, it's not about that, guys. I can break it down for you simply. Love and love. Make sure that you do that with all parts of your being, but love and love. Because being righteous is not about being right. The righteous do not react when they are chided. They cannot be deviated from their path. They are not reactionary. Christ was hit by several low blows. The Pharisees, they were hit by several blows too. They were blows to their pride. They were blows that they set themselves up for. But Christ did not deviate from his path, and he did not react to them. But the Pharisees, what did they do? They started freaking out. They started compromising who they were. They first start that conversation as people who are righteous, when really they're just right. But all of a sudden, what did they do? They were bringing people before Christ when they shouldn't have brought him before Christ. Her before Christ. They did it without having two witnesses. All of a sudden, they're not paying attention to the facts of the situation on who Christ was. All of a sudden, they're making quips about him being a bastard child. These are men who are righteous, right? No. Righteous men do not deviate. Righteous men cannot be pushed to react. Men, think about this in your own life. Think about this in your relationship. When you get pissed off at your wife and you treat her badly, because we've all done it. All of us have. And we say to ourselves, well, she shouldn't have done that. And you know what? You're probably right. She probably shouldn't have. But you deviated. You allowed yourself to react. When men don't react, men set the tone. That's what Scripture says. And Christ set the tone because a righteous person sets the tone. He doesn't react. So the question is, who are you? Do you listen for God's voice, or do you listen to the voices of your institutions? The little rules You know, we call our institutions in our lives, we call them clusters. It's a social phenomenon. We call it clustering. And every cluster has its unspoken rules. My favorite, of course, which some people deny, but every guy actually knows it's true, is that when you go to the bathroom in a public place, you never stand next to another guy unless you have to. That is just a thing. It is an unspoken rule of the social phenomenon of the clustering of men. That is true. Some people deny that, like Adam, but the reality of it is that there are just these things that you don't do. In order for you to be righteous, who are you listening to? Do you listen for God's voice, or do you listen for the voice of the institutions that make you who you are? Tell me this. Can you quote a Judd Apatow movie? Can you quote Todd Phillips? How about George Lucas? How easily does Christ spring off the tongue for you? Is your life based on the anecdotes of Yoda and his father, George Lucas, rather than God and Christ? Or perhaps is it based on the anecdotes of Batman and his father, Bob Kane? Or, if you will, Christopher Nolan? Or Buffy and her father, Joss Whedon? What is it that you have decided is the institution in your life? What are you relying on to make you righteous? When you say, I'm going to make a go of it, is your mantra, do or do not, there is no try. Do or do not, there is no try. To make it happen? Or is it, let your yes be yes and your no be no? Because one of those fails to stand up when it's being persecuted. If you couldn't tell, it's the Star Wars one. Where do you find your enlightenment? And then, what is the consequence of finding your enlightenment somewhere that's not from God? Because I would challenge you that if you find your enlightenment somewhere that's not from God, or you say, this seems godly, then when God actually comes, when the actual light comes, you won't recognize it. Because what you're looking for is Buffy or Batman. And that's hard for me to say. I'm just throwing that out there. So, are you standing with Christ, or are you on the other side? Are you one of those people who thinks they're smart, but is really grasping and making these low jabs? Do you laugh when people are making jabs at God, Christ? Do you laugh when the supposed leadership is making jabs at the normal people? As we move on to the next couple weeks, and we start to discuss Christ's continued apologetic, his way of dealing with the Pharisees, we're going to be discussing more and more about the concept of perception and judgment and how we deal with conflict. But I want you to have a sort of building awareness of who you are in the mix of these stories. I want you to sort of build upon who you are, to ask yourself, to be vulnerable. Are you being righteous, or are you just being right? Nobody can deny Some people do. I don't. So I'm going to just say, nobody can deny the concept that everybody wants to be right. Nobody can deny that when it comes down to it, even the worst person in the world, I think categorically the world generally thinks of Hitler as the worst person in the world. I'll just go out on a limb and say that, use him as an example. Nobody can deny that Hitler thought that he was doing what was right. We take that, we categorize it, we call it sociopathy or so on and so forth. But nobody can deny that when it came down to it, he thought he was doing what was right. Nobody can deny that the great villains of all time are great because when we make them more than one-dimensional, they are people who thought they were doing what was right. Emperor Palpatine thought he was doing what was right. Certainly, for a time, he did. Certainly, for a time, Caesar was doing what was right too. But, like Palpatine, or rather like Caesar, it got to his head, and he ended up doing something that was incredibly wrong. Nobody can deny that the Pharisees were doing what was right. They were trying to be relevant with Scripture. But there's just something about it. Nobody can deny that Eve thought that she was doing what was right. She took a look at that fruit and she said, "Man, that looks good." She even wanted to share that with her husband. Nobody can deny that people want to do what is right. But we are terrible at it. And righteousness, it's not about wanting to do what's right. It's not about being right. It's about being willing to be vulnerable before God and to let God do what you cannot do. We're going to talk more about that concept. About the concept that, not that we're powerless, but essentially that we are. Not that we're insignificant, but that our value for righteousness is not found in our ability to be righteous. It's found in God's ability to make us righteous. But for now, think about it. Are you trying to be righteous, or are you trying to be right? Let's pray to close.